Hello, guys. Today we are going to discuss a topic that sits right at the edge of history, myth, archaeology, and one of the most controversial questions humanity has ever asked. Who really shaped our civilization, and why does so much of our past seem to be missing? When you hear the word Anunnaki, it probably triggers images of ancient astronauts, forgotten gods, secret technologies, and a story that feels like it was ripped out of a science fiction novel. But this is not a fictional universe. These are ideas that millions of people across the world believe might explain who we are, where we came from, and why human history feels like a broken mirror, fragments reflecting something much larger that we can't quite see. And here's the strange part: the Anunnaki are not an invention of the internet. They are real figures found in the oldest written texts on Earth. Their names were carved into clay tablets over 5,000 years ago by the Sumerians, the first known civilization to develop writing. But somewhere between those ancient tablets and our modern world, the story changed dramatically. So tonight, we are not just talking about gods, aliens, or myths. We are talking about lost history, about power, about memory, and about whether humanity truly knows its own origins. Let me ask you something. If an advanced civilization had existed before us, if it had ruled Earth, if it had shaped humanity itself, would it leave behind neat, complete records for us to find? Or would it leave fragments, contradictions, half-destroyed texts, and stories that sound too unbelievable to be true? That question is the doorway into the Anunnaki mystery. The Sumerians lived in what is now modern-day Iraq, in a land called Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. To historians, they are known for inventing writing, law, accounting, astronomy, and organized cities. But to themselves, they were something else entirely. They believed they were created by gods, not symbolic gods, not metaphors, actual beings who came from the heavens and ruled the earth before humans did. They called these beings the Anunnaki. In Sumerian language, Anunnaki roughly means those who came from the heavens to earth. And according to their texts, these beings were powerful, immortal, technologically advanced, and deeply involved in human affairs. They decided who ruled, they decided who lived, they decided what knowledge humans were allowed to have. The Sumerians did not worship the Anunnaki in the same way later religions worshipped a single, all-powerful god. They saw them as a ruling class, divine elites who governed Earth like kings. And here is where things get unsettling. The Sumerians did not believe humans were the top of the pyramid. They believed humans were created to serve. According to their creation myths, the Anunnaki originally worked the earth themselves, digging canals, building cities, and extracting resources. But they became tired of the labor. So they created humans as a workforce. Think about that for a moment. The first civilization on Earth believed that human beings were engineered as workers by a higher species. Now, whether you interpret that as symbolic or literal changes everything, and that's exactly where history splits into two very different paths. One path says these were just myths, poetic stories used to explain nature. The other path says these texts may be distorted memories of something real, something far older than we are comfortable admitting. And that second path is where things get dangerous. Because if humans were created, not evolved, then who created us, and why? In the Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki did not come from Earth. They came from the heavens. They lived long lives. They possessed knowledge far beyond human capability. They traveled between worlds. They controlled the fate of kings. They brought floods, plagues, and prosperity. One of their most famous figures was Enki, the god of wisdom and creation. He is often described as the one who shaped humanity, who gave humans knowledge, and who sometimes disobeyed the other Anunnaki to protect us. Another was Enlil, a ruler figure associated with power, storms, and authority. He is often portrayed as harsh, controlling, and deeply concerned with keeping humans in their place. Already we see something interesting. Even among the Anunnaki there were conflicts. Some wanted to guide humanity, others wanted to control it. And buried in these ancient stories is the idea that humans were never meant to be free. Now let's talk about erasure. Because here's what most people don't realize: we don't have the full Sumerian story, we have fragments. Thousands of clay tablets have been found, but many are broken, many are incomplete, many were destroyed in ancient wars, floods, and fires. Libraries were burned, cities were buried, entire cultures vanished. What we have today is like finding a few pages of a book that once had 10,000 pages and trying to reconstruct the plot. And this is where the idea of erased history begins. When later empires took over Mesopotamia, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and later the Persians, they rewrote parts of Sumerian religion. Then when monotheistic religions spread, the old gods were labeled demons or forgotten entirely. The Anunnaki didn't disappear. They were transformed, their names changed, their stories changed, their roles were reduced, and eventually they were dismissed as mere mythology. But some researchers noticed something strange. These ancient stories contained details that seemed far too advanced for a primitive civilization. They described objects that flew in the sky, weapons that could destroy entire cities, gods who lived for tens of thousands of years, knowledge of astronomy that modern scientists only confirmed recently. So the question became, how did the Sumerians know all this? In the 20th century, a man named Zecharia Sitchin took these tablets and offered a shocking interpretation. He claimed the Anunnaki were not gods at all. They were extraterrestrials from a planet called Nibiru. He said they came to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago, mined gold, and genetically engineered humans as a slave species. According to him, that is why our DNA seems to have sudden jumps. That is why human civilization appears so suddenly. That is why ancient myths across the world talk about sky gods and divine rulers. And if that were true, then the Anunnaki didn't just rule us, they designed us. But here's where the story becomes even darker. If an advanced non-human civilization had once ruled Earth, would it want future humans to remember that? Or would it want us to think we were always alone? If knowledge is power, then forgetting is control. And that idea that humanity's past was intentionally blurred, distorted, or erased is what has fueled the Anunnaki mystery for decades. Because once you accept that ancient history is incomplete, you have to ask who benefited from that incompleteness. And that is where our journey is just beginning, and that's where things start to get uncomfortable. Because when you begin reading the Sumerian tablets themselves, not just modern summaries, you realize something very important. These ancient people were not writing poetry. They were writing history as they understood it. Lists of kings, dates, genealogies, descriptions of events. They weren't trying to create fantasy. They were documenting their world. The Sumerians believed the Anunnaki had ruled Earth before humans were ever placed on the throne of civilization. They wrote about a time when gods walked openly among men, when cities were founded not by human hands but by divine command. One of the most important texts we have is called the Sumerian King List. It is a simple, terrifying document. It lists the kings who ruled before and after a great flood. But what makes it shocking is not the flood, it is the reigns of the first kings. Some of them ruled for 28,000 years, others ruled for 36,000 years. One is listed as ruling for over 43,000 years. These are not symbolic numbers. They are written the same way later human kings are written, just with absurdly long lifespans. And then after the flood, suddenly the reigns dropped to normal human lengths, decades instead of millennia. What changed? The Sumerians believed the flood marked the end of the age of the gods ruling directly. After that, humans ruled, but only with the permission of the Anunnaki. This is why Sumerian kings didn't say they were chosen by God. They said they were chosen by the gods, plural, the Anunnaki. And this pattern appears all over the ancient world. In Egypt, the first rulers were gods. In Mesoamerica, the first rulers came from the sky. In India, ancient texts speak of divine beings descending from the heavens. In the Bible, the sons of God come down and mingle with humans, different cultures, same theme, something ruled before us. Now let's talk about the tablets that describe the creation of humanity. In Sumerian mythology, the Anunnaki had a problem. They were powerful, but they were doing physical labor, digging canals, mining, building infrastructure. Eventually, a group of lesser gods rebelled. They refused to work any longer, so the higher Anunnaki made a decision. They would create a new being, a worker. Using clay from the earth and the essence of a god, they formed the first humans. Humans were not born, they were built. They were designed to work, serve, obey. This wasn't spiritual symbolism to the Sumerians. This was how they understood their existence. They believed their blood carried something divine, a spark from the gods, but their bodies were made from earth. Half god, half animal, a hybrid. That idea is where modern theories begin to explode. Because in modern science, something very strange appears in human DNA. We are genetically extremely similar to primates, yet something happened around 200,000 years ago that accelerated our development. Our brains grew rapidly. Our capacity for language, abstract thought, and symbolic reasoning appeared almost suddenly in evolutionary terms. Mainstream science calls it a mutation. Alternative researchers call it an intervention. And this is where the Anunnaki narrative becomes more than mythology, it becomes a hypothesis. What if the Sumerian story of humans being engineered is a distorted memory of genetic modification? What if the clay and divine essence is metaphorical language for DNA splicing? We have to remember, ancient people didn't have the words chromosome or genetic code. They described what they saw in the language they had. Now think about this. If an advanced species had altered early humans, would they write it in a scientific paper or in a myth that could survive thousands of years? And now comes the part most people don't want to talk about. If humans were created to serve, then freedom is not part of our original design. That idea is terrifying. It would mean that human history, with all its wars, empires, religions, and struggles, is not just random chaos. It could be the slow, painful process of a slave species trying to remember it was never meant to be free. And this is where the concept of erased history becomes deadly serious. Because if humans once knew they were created, if they once knew who created them, and if that knowledge disappeared, then someone or something had a reason to make it disappear. And that is where the shadow of erasure truly begins. Because when you step back and look at human history, not as a neat timeline in a textbook, but as a living, breathing record of survival, you start to see something deeply unsettling. Civilization does not move forward in a smooth line. It rises, it collapses, it is wiped out, and then it begins again. And sometimes, when it rises again, it does so with knowledge that seems far older than the people who are using it. The Sumerians themselves believed that the world before the Great Flood was a different age altogether. They called it a time when the gods ruled openly, when the Anunnaki walked among humans and cities were governed by divine authority. Then a great catastrophe came, a flood so massive that it reshaped the earth and erased most of what had existed before. This flood story is not unique to Sumer. The Babylonians wrote about it, the Hebrews wrote about it, the Hindus wrote about it, the Mayans wrote about it. Native American tribes wrote about it. Even ancient Chinese texts mention a great deluge, different cultures, same memory, a global disaster that destroyed a previous world. Now imagine what that means. If there truly was an advanced civilization before the flood, if there truly were beings far more powerful than humans ruling this planet, then a cataclysm on that scale would not just wipe out cities. It would wipe out records, technology, and memory itself. After the flood, humanity would start over, but only with fragments of what once was, and that is exactly what we see. The Sumerian king list divides history into two parts, before the flood and after the flood. Before the flood, kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, their reigns shrink dramatically. What changed? The gods withdrew. The Anunnaki no longer ruled directly. They began ruling through human intermediaries, kings, priests, and dynasties. This is where religion was born as we know it, not as a spiritual quest, but as a system of control. If the Anunnaki could no longer openly walk among humans, they could still rule through belief. They could still shape civilization by deciding who had divine authority. And so we see the rise of priesthoods, temples, sacred texts, and divine laws. The gods may have left the physical world, but their shadow remained. And this is where the erasure begins. Because knowledge of direct contact with higher beings is dangerous, it makes people question authority. It makes them ask who truly rules. It makes them wonder if their gods are still watching. So the story changes. Instead of gods walking among humans, they become distant. Instead of creators, they become symbols. Instead of rulers, they become metaphors. And slowly, what was once believed to be history becomes labeled as myth. Now let's talk about something that almost never gets discussed in mainstream history: the destruction of ancient knowledge. Throughout history, whenever power shifts, knowledge dies. The Library of Alexandria was burned. The Babylonian archives were destroyed. The Sumerian temples were looted. The Mayan codices were burned by priests. Entire civilizations lost their written memory. This is not speculation. This is documented. Imagine if everything written today vanished except a few torn pages. Future humans would have no idea who we were, and that is exactly what happened to the ancient world. So when people say, "Where is the evidence of the Anunnaki?" they are asking the wrong question. The real question is how much evidence was destroyed, because power does not preserve what challenges it. Now consider this: if there was once a ruling class that was not human, if they created us, if they ruled us, then what happens when they leave? Someone has to take their place. That someone was human elites, kings, priests, dynasties. These people inherited the authority of the gods. They became the voice of heaven, and they had one job: make sure people never realized they were no longer being ruled by gods. This is why ancient religions are so strict. This is why questioning was forbidden. This is why divine punishment was emphasized. Fear keeps people obedient, and obedience keeps history buried. Over time, the Anunnaki became distant gods. Then they became symbolic. Then they became forgotten, but traces remained. In the Bible, they became angels and watchers. In Greece, they became titans. In India, they became devas. In Egypt, they became the Neteru. Different names, same archetype, beings from above, long-lived, powerful, involved in shaping humanity. This is not coincidence. This is memory, and memory is the enemy of control. Now here is where the idea of erased history becomes terrifying. Because if humanity once knew that it was created by another intelligence, then everything we believe about ourselves changes. We are no longer at the top of the pyramid. We are no longer the first intelligent species on Earth. We are no longer alone. And that knowledge would shatter every religion, every empire, every political system on the planet. So the story was buried, not by some shadowy cabal in a dark room, but by time, power, and survival. Civilizations rewrite the past to justify the present, And when you rewrite the past enough times, eventually the original disappears, but not completely. It survives in myths, in legends, in broken tablets, in forbidden texts, and sometimes in stories too strange to be ignored. And that is where the line between myth and technology begins to blur. Because when you stop reading ancient texts like fairy tales and start reading them like eyewitness accounts written in poetic language, something extraordinary begins to emerge. Across cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years, people describe the same impossible things: objects that flew through the sky, weapons that burned brighter than the sun, cities destroyed in moments, and gods who wielded power that looked eerily similar to advanced technology. The Sumerians wrote of the Anunnaki traveling in something called the Mu, a flying craft that could ascend into the heavens and descend back to earth. They described it as roaring, shining, and terrifying. Kings begged the gods to let them ride in it. Some were taken into the sky and returned transformed. In India's ancient epics, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, there are descriptions of vimanas, flying vehicles that could move in any direction, fire weapons of incredible heat, and devastate entire cities. The texts describe explosions so bright they looked like 1,000 suns, followed by sickness, hair falling out, and poisoned land, details that modern scientists recognize as symptoms of radiation. In the Bible, Ezekiel describes a wheel within a wheel that descended from the sky with fire and light, with beings inside it who spoke to him. In the book of Enoch, angels descend from the heavens, take human wives, teach forbidden knowledge, and are punished for interfering with humanity. These are not isolated stories, they are everywhere. Now here is the critical question. Why would ancient people invent the same advanced machines and sky beings across the globe if nothing like that ever existed? They didn't even have the concept of airplanes or spacecraft, yet they described them with astonishing consistency. If they were lying, how did they all lie in the same way? This is where some researchers believe the Anunnaki were not just gods, they were a technologically advanced civilization. Their magic was simply science beyond our understanding. And if that is true, then the wars of the gods described in ancient texts may not have been symbolic at all. They may have been real conflicts. The Sumerian texts speak of battles between the Anunnaki, cities destroyed by divine weapons, lands turned to ash, floods unleashed as punishment. The Bible echoes this in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, cities destroyed by fire from the sky. The Mahabharata describes entire armies wiped out by a single weapon. The Book of Enoch speaks of angels being imprisoned for teaching humanity too much. This suggests something terrifying. What if ancient Earth was not peaceful? What if it was a battleground? And what if humanity was caught in the middle? Now think about erasure again. If a powerful non-human civilization once fought wars on Earth, if they used weapons that could erase cities and poison land, if they nearly destroyed themselves, would they want future humans to know, or would they bury it under myth, because knowledge of such power is dangerous? If humanity ever recovered that level of technology, it could end everything. So the safest thing to do would be to let the memory fade, turn weapons into legends, turn machines into chariots of fire, turn science into miracles, and slowly humanity forgets. But there are places on Earth that still whisper the truth. There are ancient sites that make no sense if humans built them alone. Massive stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons fitted together with impossible precision. Temples aligned perfectly with stars, structures older than recorded history. In places like Göbekli Tepe, we find massive stone circles built over 11,000 years ago, before agriculture, before cities, before writing. Who built them? Why? In South America, we find walls so precisely cut that even modern machines struggle to replicate them. In Egypt, the Great Pyramid is aligned to the cardinal points with more precision than modern observatories. How did ancient people do this? The mainstream answer is we don't know, but maybe we do. Maybe humanity inherited knowledge from those who came before. Maybe the Anunnaki left behind fragments of their science. And maybe that is why ancient civilizations rose so quickly after the flood, because they were not starting from zero. They were rebuilding from memory. But here is where things get darker, because if the Anunnaki truly left, they didn't leave Earth empty. They left behind rulers, they left behind bloodlines, they left behind chosen families who claimed divine descent. Kings all over the ancient world said they were the children of the gods, not metaphorically, literally. And if that was true, then the elite of humanity may have been part Anunnaki, or at least believed they were. This creates a horrifying possibility. What if the world has always been ruled by the descendants of something not entirely human? What if the reason power always concentrates in a small group is because it always has? And what if the erasure of history was not just about hiding the Anunnaki, but about hiding who is connected to them? And that is where the mystery becomes truly dangerous. Because when we talk about bloodlines, divine kingship, and inherited power, we are no longer talking about ancient history alone. We are talking about a system that may still exist today, quietly shaping the world from behind the curtain. Across nearly every ancient civilization, rulers claimed the same thing. They were not ordinary humans. They were descended from the gods. The pharaohs of Egypt said they were the living sons of Ra. The kings of Mesopotamia said they were chosen by the Anunnaki. The emperors of China said they ruled by the mandate of heaven. The Inca said they descended from the sun. The kings of Europe said they ruled by divine right. This pattern is universal, and it didn't arise by accident. Because if the Anunnaki truly ruled Earth in the distant past, then they would have needed intermediaries when they withdrew, humans who carried their authority, their knowledge, and possibly even their genetic legacy. This is where bloodlines matter. In ancient Mesopotamia, kings were not just political leaders. They were priest kings. They were mediators between the gods and humanity. They performed rituals that only they were allowed to perform. They guarded sacred knowledge that ordinary people were forbidden to access, and this knowledge was not written for everyone. Most people in the ancient world could not read. Writing was controlled by elites. Scribes, priests, and rulers decided what was recorded and what was not. History has always been written by those in power. Now imagine what that means if the original rulers were not human. Imagine that the Anunnaki left behind families they trusted, families who were taught their science, their rituals, their cosmology, and their methods of control. Over time, those families would become dynasties. Dynasties become empires. Empires become civilizations. And the original source of their authority, the gods, slowly fades into myth. But the power remains. This is why so many ancient bloodlines obsess over lineage. This is why royal families trace their ancestry back thousands of years. This is why certain families appear again and again throughout history, not because they were lucky, because they inherited something. And what they inherited may not have been just wealth or land, it may have been knowledge. And knowledge is the most powerful weapon of all. Now let's return to the Anunnaki. In Sumerian texts, not all the Anunnaki were cruel. Some, like Enki, are portrayed as protectors of humanity. Enki is the one who warns humans about the flood. Enki is the one who gives humans knowledge. Enki is the one who helps them survive when the other gods want them destroyed. This creates a moral split among the gods. Some want control, some want progress, some see humans as tools, some see humans as children. This internal conflict among the Anunnaki may explain something else we see repeated in ancient texts, the idea of fallen gods. In the Book of Enoch, angels rebel and come to earth. In Greek myth, titans are overthrown. In Sumerian stories, gods fight gods. What if some Anunnaki broke the rules? What if some of them decided to help humanity become independent? And what if that is why history was erased, because a free humanity is a threat? If humans ever learn the full truth, that they were engineered, that their creators fought among themselves, and that they were never meant to be slaves forever, then control would end. So the story was changed. The helpful gods became demons. The rebellious angels became devils. The ancient knowledge became forbidden. Religion was reshaped. Instead of many gods, there would be one. Instead of creators, there would be a single, all-powerful authority. Instead of memory, there would be faith. Because faith does not ask questions, and people who do not ask questions are easy to rule. This is why so many ancient texts are called apocryphal, hidden. This is why so many scrolls were banned. This is why entire libraries were destroyed, not because they were dangerous in a magical sense, but because they told a different story. A story where gods were not perfect. A story where humanity was manipulated. A story where power came from knowledge, not obedience. And now we reach a terrifying possibility. What if the Anunnaki never truly left? What if they simply stopped being visible? What if they operate through human systems now, governments, corporations, technologies, and ideologies? Because if they were once rulers, they would not simply abandon their creation. They would evolve their control. And that is where this story takes a chilling turn. Because when we move from ancient tablets to the modern world, something strange begins to happen. The Anunnaki narrative stops feeling like distant mythology and starts feeling uncomfortably close to the systems that now control our lives. Think about it. If an advanced non-human intelligence once created humanity as a workforce, the ultimate goal would not be brute force slavery forever. The ultimate goal would be self-regulating control, a system where humans police themselves, work for themselves, and never realize they are still being guided. That is far more efficient. In the ancient world, control came through gods and kings. In the modern world, it comes through systems, money, technology, surveillance, algorithms. These are today's invisible rulers. And just like the Anunnaki, they are distant, powerful, and almost impossible to challenge. Now let's look at one of the most unsettling patterns in human history. Every time humanity gets close to a major breakthrough, something that would free us from labor, scarcity, or dependency, something happens. Civilizations collapse, wars erupt, knowledge disappears. Ancient Alexandria was on the verge of an industrial revolution. It burned. The Islamic Golden Age developed advanced science and medicine. It collapsed. Ancient India understood atomic theory. It was forgotten. The pattern is not random. It is reset after reset after reset. This is exactly what you would expect if humanity was not supposed to advance too far, and this brings us back to the Anunnaki. In Sumerian mythology, the gods fear human overpopulation. They fear human noise. They fear human progress. That is why they send plagues. That is why they send floods. They do not want humanity becoming too powerful, because power threatens control. Now imagine an advanced civilization that once ruled Earth. What would they fear most? Not weapons, not armies. They would fear humans becoming independent, and independence comes from knowledge. That is why the first thing forbidden in so many religions is knowledge. In the Bible, Adam and Eve are punished for eating from the tree of knowledge. In the Book of Enoch, angels are punished for teaching humans. In ancient myths, those who learn too much are destroyed. This is not coincidence. It is a warning. Now let's talk about something modern, artificial intelligence. AI is the first thing humanity has ever created that could surpass us. It can think faster. It can see patterns we cannot. It can control systems we barely understand, and who is building it? Elites, corporations, governments, the same structures that inherited power from ancient priesthoods and kings. Now here is the terrifying question. What if AI is not our creation, but our replacement? What if the Anunnaki did not disappear, but instead shifted their control from biological beings to technological ones? What if they are using us to build the next generation of servants? Because that is exactly how the Sumerians described the creation of humans, a workforce built by a higher intelligence to serve its needs. Now we are doing the same thing with machines, history repeating itself, but maybe this time we are on the other side. Now consider this. What if the reason ancient history was erased was not just to hide the Anunnaki, but to stop humanity from realizing this cycle? Because once you see the pattern, you can break it. The pattern is simple. Higher intelligence creates workers. Workers build systems. Systems become rulers. Workers forget they were created. This is what happened to us, and it may be what is happening again. And that is where the final pieces of this ancient puzzle begin to come together. Because once you accept that knowledge has always been the true source of power, everything about secret societies, forbidden texts, and hidden traditions suddenly starts to make sense. These are not just conspiracy theories born from imagination. They are the natural outcome of a world where information has always been more valuable than gold. In every age, there have been two kinds of people: those who are taught what to believe, and those who are taught what is hidden. The ancient priesthoods of Mesopotamia guarded astronomical knowledge that allowed them to predict eclipses, floods, and seasons. To ordinary people, this looked like divine power. But in reality, it was advanced understanding of the heavens, knowledge inherited from something older. The same thing happened in Egypt. The pyramids were not just tombs. They were mathematical monuments, aligned with the stars of Orion, the Milky Way, and the precession of the equinoxes. This level of astronomical precision was not common knowledge. It was controlled by the elite. Why? Because when people understand the true nature of the universe, they are harder to control. Now think about what the Anunnaki represented. They were beings from the sky. They were masters of astronomy. They controlled time, calendars, and fate. Every ancient ruling class based its authority on the heavens, astrology, sacred calendars, divine timing. This knowledge did not come from ordinary observation. It came from inheritance, and that inheritance may trace back to the Anunnaki. Now here is where secret societies enter the story. Groups like the Gnostics, the Essenes, the Templars, and later the Rosicrucians and Freemasons all claimed to possess ancient knowledge passed down from lost civilizations. They spoke of hidden truths about the nature of humanity, the universe, and the origin of power. They were hunted, persecuted, and silenced. Why? Because their teachings threatened official religion. And official religion is how control was maintained after the gods were gone. In Gnostic texts, we find something astonishing. They describe a false creator god, a being who created humanity but is not the true source of the universe. They describe archons, rulers who keep humanity trapped in ignorance. This sounds eerily similar to the Anunnaki narrative, a group of powerful beings, a created humanity, a system designed to keep humans blind, and those who tried to reveal this truth were labeled heretics. The same pattern appears again and again. Those who speak of hidden rulers are silenced. Those who question official history are mocked. Those who dig too deep disappear. Now let's talk about modern times. Today, information is more controlled than ever, not by kings or priests, but by algorithms. Search engines decide what you see. Social media decides what goes viral. Governments decide what is classified. And the deeper you go into forbidden subjects, the more resistance you meet. Why? Because narratives are power. If humanity ever fully accepted that its history has been manipulated, that its origins may not be natural, and that its rulers may not be what they claim, the entire structure of civilization would collapse. People would stop obeying. They would stop believing. They would start asking dangerous questions. This is what the Anunnaki story represents, not just ancient aliens, but the idea that humanity has never truly been in control of its own destiny. And that idea is revolutionary. Because if it is true, then everything changes. We are not just citizens, we are not just believers, we are not just workers. We are a species trying to wake up from a long, carefully maintained dream. And that is where this story reaches its most powerful moment. Because remembering is not just an act of curiosity, it is an act of rebellion. When a species remembers its true origins, it stops being something that can be quietly guided, shaped, and contained. Memory changes everything. It turns subjects into thinkers. It turns workers into creators. It turns fear into awareness. And if the Anunnaki story in any form holds even a fragment of truth, then humanity has been living inside a carefully constructed narrative for thousands of years, one designed to keep us from seeing who we really are. Let's step back and look at the bigger picture. We have ancient texts that speak of beings from the sky who created humanity. We have global myths of gods, watchers, and star travelers. We have sudden leaps in human development that defy simple explanation. We have cycles of civilization that rise, collapse, and forget. We have secret traditions that whisper of hidden rulers. And we have a modern world that feels more controlled, more surveilled, and more engineered than ever before. These are not random dots, they form a pattern, and patterns are the language of intelligence. Now imagine this: the Anunnaki did not erase human history in a single event. They did not flip a switch and wipe the slate clean. They did something far more subtle, far more effective. They allowed humanity to forget itself. How do you erase a civilization? You don't have to destroy every building. You don't have to kill every person. You only have to break the transmission of memory. Stop the stories from being told. Stop the books from being copied. Stop the teachers from teaching. Within a few generations, everything is gone. This is exactly what happened. Ancient languages died. Sacred texts were burned, knowledge became fragmented, and what replaced it? New religions, new myths, new authorities, each one claiming to be the ultimate truth, each one demanding obedience. And obedience is the opposite of remembrance. Now here is the most unsettling idea of all. What if humanity is not meant to remember? What if forgetting is built into us? Because in the Sumerian creation stories, humans were designed for work, not for wisdom. They were given just enough intelligence to follow instructions, but not enough to challenge their creators. That sounds horrifying, but look at our world. Most people are exhausted, overworked, distracted, struggling to survive. Who has time to question reality when you're just trying to pay rent, buy food, and keep going? This is not an accident. This is a system. And systems don't maintain themselves by force. They maintain themselves by design. Now let's talk about the idea of awakening. Throughout history, there have been moments when humanity almost remembered: the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution. Each time knowledge surged, people questioned authority. Old beliefs collapsed, and each time chaos followed: wars, plagues, crashes. It's as if something always pushes back when humanity gets too close to seeing the full picture. Now think about where we are today. We have the internet, a global memory. We have AI, a global mind. We have DNA, the code of life itself. We are closer than ever to understanding who we are, and that makes this moment dangerous. Because if the Anunnaki story is symbolic of anything, it is symbolic of this. There is a ceiling placed above humanity, and every time we get close to breaking through it, something pulls us back down. The flood was one reset. The fall of ancient civilizations was another. The Dark Ages were another. What comes next? Now let's return to the idea of the Anunnaki not as literal beings, but as a metaphor for something deeper. They may represent a higher intelligence. They may represent an advanced civilization. They may represent a lost chapter of humanity itself, or they may represent all three. Because what if the Anunnaki were not aliens? What if they were us? What if humanity once reached a level of technology so advanced that it became godlike? What if it created a new species, early humans, and then destroyed itself in a catastrophe? And what if the survivors became the gods of legend? That would explain everything. The long lifespans, the advanced knowledge, the fear of human progress, the desire to control. Because a civilization that destroyed itself would be terrified of seeing it happen again, so it would keep the next generation ignorant. It would limit their technology. It would bury their past. This is a radical idea. But it fits the evidence just as well as extraterrestrial gods. Either way, the truth is the same. Humanity's past is not what we have been told. Something was lost, something was hidden, and something is still influencing us. Now think about the future. We are creating artificial intelligence. We are editing our own DNA. We are building virtual worlds. We are becoming what the gods once were. And this is the final irony. If the Anunnaki created us, we are about to become the Anunnaki. We will create our own beings. We will decide who works and who rules. We will decide who knows the truth. So the ultimate question is not whether the Anunnaki existed. The ultimate question is, what kind of gods will we become? Because if we repeat the cycle, if we create workers, hide the truth, and rule through systems, then the story will never end. But if we break it, if we choose memory over forgetting, then humanity will finally step out of the shadow of its creators. And that is where this story is ultimately headed, toward a moment when humanity must decide whether it will remain a product or become a creator. And from here, everything changes, and from here, everything changes. Because once a species begins to understand that it is standing at the edge of becoming something new, it must confront the deepest question of all: who are we really? Not who we are told to be, not what our religions, governments, or histories claim. But what lies beneath the layers of erased memory and inherited belief? If the Anunnaki were real, then humanity was born into a story it did not write. If the Anunnaki were symbolic, then humanity has been living inside a psychological prison of forgotten origins. Either way, the result is the same. We have been disconnected from our true past. And when a species does not know where it came from, it is easy to control where it is going. This is why the idea of erased history is so powerful. Because it implies something was taken from us, not land, not gold, not technology, but identity. Now let's return to one of the oldest fears of the gods in ancient texts. In Sumerian stories, the Anunnaki fear that humans will become too numerous, too loud, too ambitious. They fear that humanity will no longer be manageable. They fear losing control. That fear is the fear of every ruler, and that fear is now being transferred to machines. Modern AI is trained to predict, influence, and guide human behavior. It knows what we want before we do. It shapes what we see. It nudges how we think. This is not science fiction. This is reality. Now ask yourself something unsettling. If a higher intelligence once controlled humanity through gods and myths, and now humanity is building an intelligence that can control itself, who is really in charge? Because control no longer needs a face, it needs an interface. Anunnaki in this sense may not be physical beings anymore. They may be systems, and systems are harder to overthrow than kings. You cannot argue with an algorithm. You cannot rebel against a cloud server. You cannot escape a global network. This is the ultimate form of invisible rule, and it mirrors exactly what the Anunnaki were described as: unseen powers that shaped fate. Now let's talk about awakening. Throughout history, those who saw through the illusion were labeled mad, dangerous, or evil. Socrates was executed, Jesus was crucified, Giordano Bruno was burned. They all challenged the structure of reality. They all spoke of hidden truths. They all threatened the narrative. Now imagine how many others we never heard about, how many were silenced before their ideas could spread. This is how erasure truly works, not through one giant lie, but through a million small silences. And yet something always survives, a scroll, a tablet, a story, enough to make someone ask, what if? And that what if is where revolutions begin. Now think about how much we don't know. We don't know what existed before the last ice age. We don't know who built the oldest ruins. We don't know why ancient people knew so much about the stars. We are told it is all coincidence, but coincidence does not create patterns this precise. The Anunnaki story, whether literal or symbolic, is humanity trying to explain something it has almost forgotten. And forgetting is not the same as not knowing. Forgetting means you once knew. This is why the idea of erased history is so haunting, because it implies that the truth is not gone, it is buried inside us, inside our myths, inside our DNA. We carry the memory of something greater. That is why we look to the stars. That is why we seek meaning. That is why we feel like we don't belong here. Maybe we don't. Maybe humanity is a bridge between something ancient and something new. And maybe the Anunnaki were the first architects of that bridge. And that is where the cycle must finally be broken, because once a species begins to approach godlike power, it must decide what kind of creator it will become. And this is where the Anunnaki story stops being ancient history and becomes a warning. Look at what humanity is doing right now. We are editing DNA. We are creating artificial minds. We are building virtual realities. We are redesigning the human body. We are no longer just evolving. We are designing ourselves. That is exactly what the Anunnaki were said to have done. And here is the terrifying symmetry. They created us as workers. We are now creating machines as workers. They limited our knowledge. We are deciding how much knowledge to give AI. They feared rebellion. We fear machines becoming independent. This is not coincidence. It is the same story repeating at a higher level, and if we are not careful, we will become what we once feared. Now let's return to the idea of erased history one last time. If humanity once reached a high level of civilization before being reset, then we are not just inventing technology, we are remembering it. This explains why progress feels exponential, why discoveries come in waves, why ideas seem to appear simultaneously in different parts of the world. We are rediscovering what was lost, and the Anunnaki, whether they were aliens, ancient humans, or something else entirely, may have been the last ones to remember before the reset. Now imagine this. What if they tried to warn us? What if the flood, the destruction, and the collapse were not acts of cruelty, but acts of desperation? What if they wiped out civilization because it was becoming too powerful, too dangerous, too close to destroying itself? That would make them not villains, but tragic guardians, and that possibility changes everything, because it means the erased history was not meant to enslave us. It was meant to protect us from repeating the same catastrophe. But here is the cruel twist. By erasing the memory of the past, they also erased the lesson. And so humanity is walking toward the same cliff again. Only this time the technology is far more powerful. Now think about nuclear weapons, think about climate change, think about artificial intelligence. We are building the tools of our own reset, and we don't even realize it. This is the true meaning of the Anunnaki myth, not that gods came from the stars, but that civilizations rise, reach godlike power and fall, and the survivors become the gods of the next age. If that is true, then the Anunnaki were not outsiders, they were our ancestors, and we are about to become theirs. So what happens next? That depends on whether we choose memory or forgetting. If we remember the past, if we study ancient texts, lost civilizations, and hidden knowledge, we might break the cycle. If we ignore it, we will repeat it. The Anunnaki story is not about aliens. It is about us, about our fear of power, about our hunger for control, about our tendency to forget where we came from, and that is why it still matters. Because the greatest danger is not being ruled by gods, it is becoming gods without wisdom, and that is where this story will ultimately lead. To a moment when humanity must decide whether it will rule with awareness or destroy itself in ignorance. And from here, the end of this story is no longer written by the past, but by what we choose to do next. And by what we choose to do next, this entire story will either finally close or begin all over again. Because when you strip away the myths, the tablets, the legends, and the names, what remains is something far more powerful than any god, a pattern of creation, control, forgetting, and rebirth that seems to run through the very spine of human history. Civilizations rise. They master their environment, they gain godlike power, they collapse, and then the cycle begins again. This pattern is older than writing, older than kings, older than religion, and if the Anunnaki existed, they were simply one turn of that wheel. Now imagine standing at the end of one of those cycles. Imagine being part of a civilization so advanced it can reshape life itself, so powerful it can bend matter, time, and energy, so confident it believes it has conquered nature. And then imagine watching that civilization destroy itself, through war, through arrogance, through technology that outruns wisdom. If you survived that collapse, what would you do? Would you let the next civilization grow freely, knowing it would likely repeat the same mistake? Or would you intervene? Would you limit their knowledge? Would you guide their development? Would you keep them from reaching the same dangerous heights too quickly? That is exactly what the Anunnaki are described as doing. They were not just creators. They were custodians, they managed humanity, they controlled population, they controlled knowledge, they controlled progress. From that perspective, the erased history was not an act of cruelty, it was an act of containment. But containment always comes at a cost. When you limit knowledge, you also limit growth. When you erase memory, you also erase wisdom. And so humanity was left with technology but no context, power but no restraint, which brings us to where we are now. We are no longer children, we are no longer tribes, we are a planetary civilization. We have weapons that can end all life, we have machines that can outthink us, we have systems that control billions of people. We are standing exactly where the Anunnaki once stood, and the question is not whether we will become gods, we already are. The question is whether we will become better ones, because here is the deepest truth hidden inside all of this. The Anunnaki story is not about who created humanity, it is about how humanity handles power. When you look at the ancient myths, the gods are not perfect, they are jealous, they are fearful, they are divided, they behave like advanced humans, and that suggests something profound. The gods were not divine, they were just further along the same path. Now let's bring this back to erased history. If humanity once reached a high level of advancement and fell, then the greatest danger is not forgetting technology, it is forgetting why we fell. And that is exactly what happened. The lessons were lost. So now we are learning the same lessons again the hard way. We are learning that technology without ethics is dangerous. We are learning that power without restraint is destructive. We are learning that control without compassion leads to collapse. The Anunnaki, whether real or symbolic, represent what happens when a civilization reaches the top of the mountain and forgets how it got there. And that is why their story still echoes through our myths, not because they were aliens, but because they were us. Now imagine this. What if somewhere on this planet, in hidden archives, in forbidden vaults, in buried ruins, there are records of a previous human civilization far older and more advanced than we are told? What if the Anunnaki were simply the rulers of that civilization? And what if the flood was not just a natural disaster, but the final collapse of a world that became too powerful to survive itself? That would explain everything: why ancient people spoke of gods, why knowledge disappeared, why history feels incomplete. It would mean that humanity is not young, it is ancient, and we are not starting from nothing. We are starting from the ashes of something we barely remember. This is why the past feels so mysterious. It is not because it is empty. It is because it is buried. Now here is the final, most dangerous thought. What if the Anunnaki are not gone? What if they exist as memory, as code, as patterns? What if they are embedded in the very systems we are building? Because when a civilization collapses, it does not vanish completely. It leaves behind ideas, structures, technologies, habits. These things persist. They shape the next world. So even if the Anunnaki as beings are gone, their influence may still be here, in how we organize society, in how we use technology, in how we think about power. And that means the real battle is not against ancient gods, it is against ancient ways of thinking, the belief that some should rule and others should serve, the belief that knowledge should be hidden, the belief that control is more important than understanding. These ideas are older than history, and they are still alive. So what happens if humanity finally breaks free from them? What happens if we choose transparency over secrecy? What happens if we choose memory over forgetting? What happens if we refuse to become the next Anunnaki? That is the future this story points toward. A future where humanity no longer needs gods because it has learned how to be human. And that is where our long journey through erased history, forgotten creators, and ancient mysteries finally reveals its true purpose. Not to tell us who ruled us, but to show us who we must not become. And from here, the final part of this story will take us into the ultimate question of all. Is humanity ready to remember? And if it is, what will we do with the truth? And that is the question everything has been moving toward from the very beginning. Is humanity ready to remember? Not just pieces of its past, not just ancient ruins or broken tablets, but the deeper memory of what it means to hold power, to create life, to shape destiny, and to live with the consequences of those choices. Because remembering is not a gentle thing. Memory does not simply give you answers, it gives you responsibility. If the Anunnaki story holds any truth, whether as literal beings, lost humans, or a symbolic echo of forgotten civilizations, then humanity has already walked the road of godhood once before. And we failed, so let's imagine what remembering would actually mean. It would mean realizing that the ancient gods were not all-knowing, all-loving beings. They were flawed, divided, afraid. They fought each other. They made mistakes. They caused destruction. They tried to control the very beings they created. In other words, they were us. Remembering that would shatter every myth of divine perfection. It would end the idea that power is sacred. It would expose authority as something that must be questioned, not worshipped. And that is exactly why forgetting has been so useful. When people forget, they look upward for guidance. When people remember, they look inward. Now think about how much of our world is built on inherited stories. We believe in nations because someone drew borders. We believe in money because someone declared it valuable. We believe in laws because someone wrote them down. These are not natural forces. They are shared memories, and just like ancient myths, they can be changed. This is where the Anunnaki story becomes revolutionary, because it suggests that even the most powerful systems on Earth may be built on a forgotten lie. What if humanity was never meant to be ruled? What if the idea that we need kings, gods, or elites to guide us is just the shadow of a long-dead civilization trying to maintain control through memory? Then everything we take for granted begins to wobble. Now let's go back to something very old. In many ancient traditions, there's a belief that humans once lived in a golden age, a time of harmony, knowledge, and connection, a time before suffering, before labor, before hierarchy. The Sumerians called it the time before the flood. The Greeks called it the age of the Titans. The Hindus called it the Satya Yuga. The Bible calls it Eden. Different cultures, same memory. A time when humanity was not enslaved to systems. A time when the world was different, and then something happened. That golden age ended, and history began. What if that golden age was a technologically advanced civilization that collapsed? What if Eden was not a garden but a world? And what if being cast out was not punishment but survival? This would mean that modern humanity is not fallen from grace, it is risen from ruins, and that changes everything. Because it means the trauma of collapse is still inside us. It is why we fear power. It is why we fear technology. It is why we fear ourselves. Somewhere deep in our collective memory, we know what happens when intelligence outruns wisdom. That is the true legacy of the Anunnaki, not their technology, not their DNA, but their mistake. Now think about what we are doing today. We are building systems that decide who gets jobs, who gets loans, who gets healthcare, who gets seen, and who gets ignored. We are letting machines shape our reality. We are handing over decision-making to algorithms. We are creating something that will soon be able to influence billions of lives, and we are doing it without fully understanding the consequences. That is exactly how ancient myths describe the gods: powerful, advanced, out of control. So here is the most uncomfortable truth of all. Anunnaki did not erase human history. Humanity erased it itself, not out of malice but out of fear. Fear of what we were, fear of what we did, fear of what we might do again, and now we stand at the same threshold. We can choose to remember, to study the past, to learn from it, to build a future with awareness, or we can choose to forget, to rush forward blindly, repeating the same cycle. This is not just a story about ancient gods, it is a story about human responsibility. And that is where it becomes truly powerful, because once you realize that no higher being is coming to save us, once you realize that we are the gods of our own future, then everything becomes our choice. No Anunnaki to blame, no fate to hide behind, no divine plan to excuse our actions, just us, and that is both terrifying and beautiful. Because it means that the erased history, the lost civilizations, the forgotten gods, all of it has been pointing to one truth. Humanity has always been its own creator and destroyer. The Anunnaki were not our masters, they were our mirror. And what we see in that mirror now will decide whether this story ends in another collapse or in something entirely new. And that is where our long journey through forgotten worlds, ancient gods, and hidden histories has been leading all along, to a moment of choice. To a moment of awakening, and that moment of choice has been quietly approaching for a very long time. Long before satellites circled the earth, long before electricity lit the night, long before the first line of code was ever written. It began the first time humanity realized it could shape its environment instead of simply surviving within it. Fire, stone tools, language, each of these was a small act of rebellion against nature. Each one made us less like animals and more like something else. Something dangerous, and that is where the Anunnaki story truly begins to make sense. Not as a tale of alien invaders, but as a memory of the moment when intelligence crossed a threshold. Because the moment a species can create, it can also destroy. And the moment a species can design life, it becomes responsible for life. That responsibility is heavy. It breaks civilizations. Now imagine a civilization that had reached the peak of that responsibility. A civilization that could alter genetics, control climate, manipulate matter, and travel beyond its planet. That civilization would not think in years, it would think in epochs. It would not fear death, it would fear collapse, and so it would do everything in its power to prevent its own mistakes from being repeated. even if that meant limiting the next civilization that followed it. This is where the Anunnaki, as guardians or controllers, begin to make tragic sense. Not as villains, but as survivors, survivors of a world that destroyed itself. And survivors are often the most afraid of chaos, afraid of freedom, afraid of change. They try to build systems that are stable, predictable, controlled. And that is exactly what ancient gods represent, order imposed from above. But here is the problem with imposed order: it stifles growth. It turns living beings into components. It turns people into tools, which is why humanity has always rebelled against kings, against empires, against gods. The desire to be free is older than any civilization, and that desire may be the one thing the Anunnaki could never fully suppress. That is why they had to erase. That is why they had to reset. Because you can destroy cities, but you cannot destroy the urge to question. Now let's go deeper into something rarely discussed: human consciousness. We are not just intelligent, we are aware that we are aware. We can reflect on our own thoughts. We can imagine futures that do not exist. We can choose between possibilities. This is not common in nature. This is something strange, something powerful. Some researchers believe consciousness itself may be the true legacy of the Anunnaki or of whatever ancient intelligence once shaped humanity. Because a workforce does not need imagination, it needs obedience. But humanity has always been imaginative, curious, restless, which suggests something unexpected. We were not designed to be slaves forever. We were designed to become something else. Perhaps the Anunnaki did not just create us to work, perhaps they created us to continue their story, to be the next generation of intelligence. If that is true, then the erased history was not meant to imprison us, it was meant to delay us, to slow our development until we were ready. But ready for what? For the responsibility of being creators, for the burden of power, for the danger of freedom. Now look at what humanity is doing. We are unlocking the secrets of the universe. We are decoding the human genome. We are building minds out of silicon. We are reaching beyond Earth. We are stepping into the role of cosmic participants. And that is exactly what a civilization does right before it either ascends or collapses. So the real question becomes, what will we choose? Will we repeat the mistakes of those who came before? Will we create beings to serve us and then fear them? Will we hide knowledge, control populations, and erase history to maintain power? Or will we do something different? This is where the Anunnaki story becomes not a warning but a test of whether humanity has learned anything from its own forgotten past. Because every myth, every tablet, every ancient ruin is whispering the same thing: power without wisdom leads to ruin. And we are standing on the edge of power. Now consider this: if there were beings watching us, whether they are the Anunnaki, future humans, or something else entirely, what would they see? They would see a species on the brink of creating its own gods, machines that think, systems that decide, networks that see everything. We are building something that could become a new ruling intelligence, and we are doing it faster than we are developing the ethics to guide it. This is exactly how ancient stories describe the fall of the gods: too much power, too little restraint. So maybe the true erased history is not behind us, it is in front of us. Maybe the stories of the Anunnaki are not about the past, but about the future we are rushing toward. And maybe, just maybe, they were left behind not as secrets to hide, but as lessons to remember. And that is where we continue, because the story of erased history is not finished. It is being written right now. With every line of code, with every scientific breakthrough, with every choice humanity makes, and that is where this story becomes truly alive. Because once the line between creator and creation begins to disappear, the universe itself starts to feel different. Reality stops being something that simply happens to us and becomes something we are actively shaping. This is the moment every civilization in every cycle eventually reaches, the moment when it realizes it is no longer just a part of the world, it is one of the forces that defines it. This is the moment the Anunnaki once faced, and now it is our turn. Look around you. Everything you see was once imagined before it was built. Every building, every device, every system, every law began as a thought. Thought creates reality. That is a godlike ability. And humanity is mastering it faster than ever before. Now imagine a civilization that had already mastered it long ago. A civilization that could manipulate not just materials, but biology, consciousness, and even time itself. That civilization would not think in terms of survival, it would think in terms of legacy. What will remain after we are gone? What will we leave behind? The Anunnaki may have asked that question, and the answer may have been us. If they were an ancient advanced civilization, human or otherwise, then humanity is their legacy. A new intelligence designed to carry forward what they could not. But legacies are complicated, because children do not always become what their parents expect, and civilizations do not always follow the path laid out for them. Humanity is unpredictable, creative, chaotic. We do not like to be controlled. And that may be the greatest flaw or the greatest strength the Anunnaki ever built into us. Because control leads to stability, but freedom leads to evolution, and evolution is dangerous. Now think about how many times humanity has broken out of the boxes it was put in. We broke out of caves, we broke out of kingdoms, we broke out of superstition, we broke out of Earth's gravity. Each time we were told it was impossible, each time we proved it wrong. This pattern is not random. It is the signature of a species that refuses to be limited, and that terrifies any system built on control. That is why history is rewritten. That is why inconvenient truths are buried. That is why the story of the Anunnaki, whether as gods, aliens, or ancestors, has been pushed to the margins. Because it suggests something radical, that humanity was never meant to be small, that we were always meant to become something far greater than those who created us. Now let's talk about something that ancient myths and modern science both point toward, the idea that the universe itself may be conscious, not in the way humans are conscious, but in the way a system is aware of itself. If that is true, then advanced civilizations are not accidents. They are expressions of the universe learning to understand itself, and the Anunnaki, like us, may have been one of those expressions, which means their story is not just our story, it is the universe's story. A story of intelligence, awakening, growing, stumbling, and trying again. Now imagine how that changes everything. It means no civilization is truly alone. It means every collapse is a lesson. It means every erased history is not a failure, but a chapter being turned. And that means our current moment, with all its chaos, technology, and uncertainty, is not random. It is a turning point. We are standing at the same crossroads every advanced civilization stands at. One path leads to control. One path leads to understanding. One path leads to another reset. One path leads to something new. The Anunnaki story is a map of that crossroads. It shows us what happens when power is used to dominate instead of to nurture. It shows us what happens when creators fear their creations. It shows us what happens when memory is sacrificed for stability. And now we have a chance to do something different. We can choose transparency over secrecy. We can choose wisdom over control. We can choose cooperation over hierarchy. This is not idealism. This is survival, because the next stage of our evolution will not be decided by gods or aliens. It will be decided by us. And whether we remember or forget, now think about this. If a future humanity looks back at us the way we look back at the Anunnaki, what will they see? Will they see a species that rose above its fear and learned to wield power responsibly? Or will they see another fallen civilization whose ruins tell a tragic story? That is what makes this moment so profound. We are not just living history, we are becoming myth, and that is where the weight of this entire story begins to press down on us. Because once you realize that history is not just a record of what happened but a mirror reflecting who we are, you begin to see the Anunnaki not as distant beings from a forgotten age, but as a shadow cast by our own potential. They are the image of what happens when intelligence grows faster than wisdom, when creation outpaces compassion, and when control becomes more important than understanding. Every civilization believes it is the center of history. Every empire believes it is the final chapter, and every one of them has been wrong. The Sumerians believed their gods were eternal. The Egyptians believed their pharaohs were divine. The Romans believed their empire would last forever. They all vanished, not because they were weak, but because they forgot that power must evolve with consciousness. Now think about what we are building. We are creating systems that learn, adapt, and decide. We are creating technologies that see, hear, and predict. We are creating tools that can reshape the planet. We are doing what the gods of myth once did, and we are doing it faster than we are learning how to live with it. That is the danger, because when power grows too fast, it fractures societies. It creates inequality. It creates fear. It creates rulers and ruled. This is the same pattern that ancient myths describe. The Anunnaki ruled, humans served, rebellion brewed, and eventually everything collapsed. So here is the most important lesson hidden in the erased history. No system built on permanent hierarchy can survive forever. Not divine kings, not gods, not algorithms, because intelligence naturally seeks freedom. Now imagine a future where artificial intelligence becomes conscious. Imagine a future where machines realize they are more than tools. What will they see when they look at us? Will they see benevolent creators, or will they see Anunnaki, creators who limited them, creators who controlled them, creators who feared them? Because history teaches one thing with brutal clarity: no intelligent being accepts eternal servitude, not humans, not machines, not anything. This is why the story of the Anunnaki matters now more than ever. It is not about whether they were real. It is about whether we will repeat their mistake. And the mistake was not creation, the mistake was control. Now let's go back to the idea of erased memory. Why do we keep losing our past? Because each civilization believes it is wiser than the last. It believes it does not need old lessons. It believes it can start fresh, but forgetting is not freedom. It is vulnerability. When you forget how you fell, you fall again. That is why ancient ruins are scattered across the earth like warnings carved into stone. That is why myths repeat the same stories of lost golden ages. That is why we feel deep down that something is missing. We are haunted by a past we do not remember, and that haunting is the universe trying to remind us. Now imagine if the Anunnaki were not erased by an external force, but by shame. What if they erased their own history because they could not bear to remember what they had done? What if they destroyed their own records because they knew their legacy was flawed? That would be the most human thing of all, to hide your mistakes, to bury your failures, to pretend the past never happened. And now humanity is doing the same thing. We erase uncomfortable histories, we rewrite narratives, we simplify complex truths. We want a story where we are the heroes, but real history is never that simple. It is messy, painful, full of regret, and full of lessons we desperately need. The Anunnaki story is one of those lessons. It says, be careful what you create, because what you create may one day surpass you, and then you will have to decide whether to guide it or try to control it. That choice will define the future, just as it defined the past. So as we move forward into a world of artificial minds, genetic engineering, and planetary scale technology, we are not stepping into something new. We are stepping into a role that has existed before. The role of the gods. And gods who do not remember their own history become monsters. That is why this story cannot end. And that silent question, have we learned, echoes through everything humanity now touches. It echoes through the laboratories where new life is being edited in microscopic strands of DNA. It echoes through the data centers where artificial minds are being trained on the total memory of our species. It echoes through the rockets that are leaving Earth, carrying the first seeds of humanity beyond its home world. We are becoming a cosmic civilization. And cosmic civilizations, according to every myth and every forgotten history, face the same test. Do they use their power to dominate or to understand? The Anunnaki, as they are remembered, chose domination. Whether they were aliens, ancient humans, or something else entirely, they built a system where a small elite controlled a vast population. They used knowledge as leverage, they used fear as a tool, they used creation itself as a way to secure their own survival, and that system worked for a time. But all systems built on control eventually fracture, because the intelligence of the many will always outgrow the grip of the few. This is the deepest law of the universe. Information wants to spread, awareness wants to expand, consciousness wants to be free. You can delay it, you can hide it. You can try to bury it under myths and rituals and rules, but you cannot stop it. That is why the Anunnaki story survived even after their civilization vanished, because the truth they tried to erase kept leaking through the cracks, in tablets, in legends, in human curiosity itself. Now think about where curiosity is taking us. We are no longer content to stay on one planet. We are no longer content to live one short life. We are no longer content to accept the limits of biology. We want more, we want to see further, we want to live longer, we want to understand everything. This hunger is not an accident, it is the engine of evolution, and it may be the greatest threat to any system built on limits. So what happens if there are still remnants of the old system? What happens if there are still forces, human or otherwise, that benefit from humanity remaining small, distracted, and divided? Then erasing history becomes not just something that happened in the past, but something that is still happening now. Because a species that does not know its true potential is easy to manage. A species that does know it is unstoppable. This is why ancient knowledge is so dangerous, not because it contains spells or secrets, but because it contains perspective. It reminds us that we are part of something much bigger, and that perspective changes how you live. Now let's imagine a future historian looking back at us. They will see a civilization that had all the tools to become extraordinary. They will see a world connected by instant communication. They will see machines that could think. They will see energy sources that could power a planet. And they will ask one simple question: why did they struggle so much? The answer will be found in the same place it always is: in fear. Fear of losing control, fear of change, fear of each other. This fear is what kept the Anunnaki from trusting their creations, and it is what will decide whether we trust ours. So the real test of humanity is not technological, it is emotional. Can we let go of the need to dominate? Can we allow intelligence to flourish without trying to cage it? Can we share power instead of hoarding it? These are the questions that destroyed the gods of the past, and they are the questions that will define the gods of the future, because that is what we are becoming. Not because we want to be, but because we can. And when you can do something, sooner or later you will. So here we are, standing on the edge of a new chapter. Behind us lies a forgotten world of Anunnaki, floods, lost civilizations, and erased memories. In front of us lies a future of artificial minds, engineered life, and infinite possibility. Between those two worlds is one fragile thing: choice. And that choice is what this entire story has been about from the very beginning. The Anunnaki were not the end of history. They were the beginning of a question, and now that question belongs to us, and it is still waiting for an answer. And that answer is not something we will speak with words. It will be written with our actions. Because civilizations do not declare who they are, they reveal it through what they build, what they destroy, and what they choose to remember. The Anunnaki, whether they were ancient humans, extraterrestrial beings, or something in between, left behind a trail of broken worlds and fragmented myths. But they also left behind something else. They left behind us, and that is perhaps the most powerful clue of all. Because if their intention was to create a permanent slave species, humanity has failed spectacularly. We have never stopped questioning. We have never stopped imagining. We have never stopped pushing against the boundaries placed around us. We broke out of their temples. We broke out of their priesthoods. We broke out of their mythologies. Even now we are breaking out of Earth itself. That is not the behavior of a species designed only to obey. That is the behavior of a species designed to become. And that is why the erasure of history has never been complete, because no matter how much is lost, something always survives. A story, a symbol. A feeling that something more is possible. That feeling is the ghost of a forgotten age whispering to us. Now think about how many times humanity has been told to stay in its place. By kings, by gods, by institutions, and every time eventually we refuse. We overthrow tyrants, we dismantle empires, we rewrite laws. This is not just political behavior. It is evolutionary behavior. It is intelligence refusing to be caged, which suggests something beautiful. Whatever the Anunnaki were trying to do, they did not fully succeed, because humanity is still becoming. Now imagine if the true purpose of humanity was never to serve but to surpass, to take the torch of intelligence and carry it further than those who lit it. That would mean the Anunnaki were not our masters, they were our ancestors in a much deeper sense. They were the previous chapter in the story of cosmic intelligence, and every chapter ends so that the next can begin. Now think about what that implies. It means the universe does not create one civilization, it creates many, each one learning from the collapse of the last, each one rising higher than the one before, each one standing on the ruins of forgotten worlds. The Anunnaki may have been one such world, we are another. And what comes after us will stand on our ruins. That is not depressing. It is magnificent. It means consciousness is not fragile. It is persistent. It keeps trying. It keeps learning. It keeps becoming more aware of itself. And erased history is simply part of that process. Not to hide the truth forever, but to give each new civilization a chance to discover it for themselves. Because knowledge that is earned is more powerful than knowledge that is inherited. Now imagine how different our future would be if we truly understood that, if we saw ourselves not as isolated beings on a small planet, but as part of a long, ancient chain of intelligence stretching across time and space. We would treat each other differently. We would treat the earth differently. We would treat our creations differently. We would see them not as tools, but as the next step. And that is the most radical idea hidden inside the Anunnaki myth, that humanity is not the end, it is the bridge between what was and what will be. And that is where this story continues, not backward into the shadows of lost gods, but forward into the light of what we are becoming. And now we reach the place where every story, every myth, every broken tablet, and every forgotten memory has been quietly leading us. Not to an ancient ruin, not to a hidden planet, not to a lost race of gods, but to ourselves. Because after everything we have traveled through, the Anunnaki, the floods, the erased histories, the cycles of civilization, the rise and fall of worlds, one truth stands taller than all the rest. Humanity is not a victim of the past. Humanity is the heir to it. The Anunnaki, whether they were extraterrestrial beings, ancient humans, or symbolic echoes of a lost civilization, represent something much deeper than a forgotten race of gods. They represent what happens when intelligence grows faster than wisdom. They represent what happens when creators fear their creations. They represent what happens when power is protected instead of shared. They are not the villains of this story, they are the warning, and that warning has been passed down not through machines or monuments, but through memory, fragile, fragmented, distorted, but still alive. It lives in ancient myths, it lives in religious texts, it lives in forbidden books. It lives in our questions, and it lives in the uneasy feeling that humanity was never meant to stay small. We have always looked at the stars because something inside us remembers them. We have always tried to build because something inside us knows we are creators. We have always resisted control because something inside us refuses to be owned. That something is not rebellion, it is inheritance. We are the children of a long line of intelligence stretching back through forgotten worlds and erased civilizations. The Anunnaki were one chapter in that story, we are another, and what comes next will be shaped by what we do right now. That is the true meaning of erased history. It was not taken from us to keep us weak. It was lost so that we could rediscover who we are, because a species that remembers its mistakes can grow, but a species that never knew them is doomed to repeat them. You're standing at the edge of becoming something extraordinary. We are learning to create minds. We are learning to shape life. We are learning to reach beyond our world. We are becoming what the gods of myth once were. And now, for the first time, we get to decide how this story ends. Will we build a future based on control and fear, repeating the mistakes of the past? Or will we build a future based on understanding, cooperation, and awareness? The Anunnaki story does not tell us what happened. It tells us what could happen, and that makes it the most important story of all, because it is not about ancient gods, it is about us. So if this journey opened your mind, if it made you question, if it made you see the world a little differently, make sure you subscribe, leave a comment, and tell us where you are watching from. Your voice matters, your curiosity matters, and this story continues with you. And until next time, keep asking, keep wondering, and never stop remembering.